Hi everyone.
Hi. We've already done quite a few videos in the Genesis playlist, and they've been spread over many months now. But we've been telling you that we wanted to go back to the beginning. So what we've got on the Genesis playlist so far is our own personal journey, most of it, which is how Genesis played such a huge role in readjusting us after leaving the Watchtower 30 years back, that we studied the book several times with our Christian friends, very few of whom had direct Jehovah's Witness contacts, but they all found this study very valuable because the first thing we noticed is we were not alone in misapprehending the intent, purpose, and contents and emphases of the book of Genesis, that the same discoveries we had made, or parallel discoveries that we've already talked about on the playlist, other people had made discoveries about the same things, and sometimes had stumbled over things that in their prior Christian life, like we had stumbled over in the Watchtower, thinking the book of Genesis was about creation, thinking it was about the flood, thinking it was about sin, maybe finding good things like the life of Abraham, the faith of Abraham in it, but generally speaking, not seeing what was there in the book. So we've already spoken to quite a few of these issues in the prior videos, but we want to go back to the beginning. That's why it's called Genesis Study 1, and start where we need to start. Because of our experience, we learned we needed humility. This text came to mind, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 and 2.
Now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know.
So we had learned from our own bitter experience that we didn't know even what we thought we knew about the book of Genesis, that its emphases were not our emphases.
And I think as ex-witnesses, you really do have to set it up this way so that you're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
Don't go into the study with any assumptions. Just see what it actually says. So we're also doing this study with live people every other Sunday at the house, mostly ex-witnesses. So this is
starting from scratch.
Yeah, it is starting from scratch. It springs all kinds of directions, but I think we're recognizing we all are humbled by the fact we have to start from scratch.
Now, the commentaries we've tended to use over the years, and they're in the dozens, by the way, because the book of Genesis has more written about it than perhaps any other Bible book, maybe with the exception of the Gospels and the book of Revelation. There's more materials available. And two of the books that have blessed us mightily, and you'll see them quoted frequently in the notes that we're going to send. We'll talk about that more at the end. You will be able to get PDF notes of all of the studies that we're doing, so don't panic if you can't catch all the details of some of the quotes we're going to be reading and talking about on here. But here's two of the commentaries that have meant the most to us. Gordon Wenham, who wrote this one on just chapters 1 to 15, 350 pages just covering those 15 chapters, an intro. And Derek Kidner, which has blessed many people beyond us. It's in the Tyndale series of New Testament commentaries. Kidner is always right to the point, brief but very potent. He's written several commentaries in that series.
Ours is falling apart.
That's how much we have used it. It's now in two pieces, right?
Yes.
A 2-volume commentary. Well, Wenham went beyond 1 volume, needless to say. This is just 1 to 15. So we're going to be quoting from these, and I like the fact that both of them start with the same point, and it's humility. They, as first-rate Bible Old Testament teachers, were both intimidated by the task of having to write a commentary on Genesis. So listen to what Kidner has to say about that in the very beginning of his book.
There can scarcely be another part of Scripture over which so many battles, theological, scientific, historical, and literary, have been fought, or so many strong opinions cherished. This very fact is a sign of the greatness and power of the book, and of the narrow limits of both our factual knowledge and our spiritual grasp.
And here is Gordon Wenham, very first paragraph of the author's preface. Commenting on Genesis, I have found my mood oscillating between elation and despair. I've been elated at the privilege of writing a commentary on such a central biblical text. I've been driven to despair by the impossibility of doing it justice, let alone dealing adequately with all that others have written about it. So you'll find as we go through the notes that we were able to draw, when we put the studies together, on dozens of books, but that's just scratching the surface of what there is on Genesis. There's not only hundreds of books, not just commentaries, but books on individual chapters of Genesis, such as Genesis chapter 1. And then there's thousands of articles out there by scholars who are continually interacting with each other over centuries, and there's very little that hasn't been said about the book of Genesis, and yet commentaries go on being written. So we thought we would take a look first at a couple of the structural indicators within the book that point to emphases and purpose in the book that you don't notice when, let's say, you're a Jehovah's Witness, or for that matter, when you're a casual Bible reader and reading Genesis and other Bible books just as devotional feeding of your own soul. And in that, you begin to see that the emphasis of the book itself is not what you thought it was. And let's start with the basic structure of the book. Graham Scroggie, by the way, another great book that I would recommend that all Christians have is this one, 1,000 pages, The Unfolding Drama of Redemption by Graham Scroggie. We'll put that in the description in case you don't catch the spelling of the name. 1,000 pages covering the whole Bible, but Scroggie is terrific at the overview, the structure of books, and the larger picture. So I recommend that as basic library for everybody. And Scroggie, in that book and several others he wrote, and if you see the lighting change, by the way, it's because I'm reading some of this from the screen. It's not your computer. Scroggie divides the book into two. First part ends at chapter 11, and the second part begins, therefore, and takes up over 3/4 of the book. He divides it into primitive history and patriarchal history. And he subheads both of those, the primitive history part, from chaos to creation to chaos. And the second part, the patriarchal history, he subheads the beginning of the new creation. Now, Campbell Morgan, another great Bible teacher of past generations, he breaks the book into 3 segments, which he calls generation, degeneration, and regeneration. And what you don't notice when you're a witness is the book itself has got internal divisions, and they are well, first one is 2:4. Let's give an example of that.
Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created.
And
second one?
And then 5:1 gives the second of these
generations, right?
How does it read in
5:1 says, this is the written account of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God.
Now, different Bibles have different words there. An account is I would say, a minority choice. The usual word that's there is, these are the generations of, or the history, this is the history of. There's 10 of them altogether, and the whole list, we'll read it for you right now. We won't read all the details and the breakdown. You'll get that in the notes. But here's the 8 that follow that.
So after the generations of Adam is the generations of Noah, the generations of the sons of Noah, the generations of Shem, the generations of Terah, the generations of Ishmael, and the generations of Isaac, the generations of Esau, and the generations of Jacob.
You know, first thing that you notice when you look at that list is there's no Abraham here. But Abraham's the major figure in the divisions of the book, because you realize when you look at the 10 generations, by the way, the Hebrew word there is Toledoth, the generations of, there's 5 before Abraham and 5 after.
But there's vast difference in the amount of space they take.
Yeah, so the first 5 up to Abraham take only 11 chapters, less than 1/4 of the book, and the next 5 take over 3/4 of the book.
And then within them there's vast difference, right?
We'll talk about a couple of them because they're actually sidebars to the basic narrative of the book of Genesis. But I'll get to that in a minute. But important to note, first of all, one of the things we learned when we were leaving the Watchtower is that the proportions of the book are completely against what we would have expected, because when you're a witness, what you find, what do you think the book's about? You think it's about creation,
The fall,
sin, the flood, maybe the spread of nations after the flood, the Tower of Babel. That's
Abraham, all. The faith of Abraham, maybe.
Yeah, all the things you think of as being what Genesis is about, the basic ones are in the first quarter of the book. And then the life of Abraham, and there you find, of course, the best example we have of faith, at least in the book of Genesis, right? We think.
But not a lot of space given. Like you would expect a lot of space given to Abraham. The example of faith.
Yeah, he gets less space than Jacob.
Yeah,
in the book.
Jacob, hardly ever do we talk about Jacob, other than the name. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about his life and the things that happened in his life.
We skip over him to get to his best son, right, Joseph?
Yeah.
So we do teach in Sunday school something about Joseph, and certainly something about Abraham, but the greater proportion of the book is not about the successes of Abraham or even of Joseph. And the greater portion of it is devoted to the mess of Jacob.
Yeah.
So we don't see that. And here's something else we don't see. That half the book is devoted to Jacob's family, for one thing, is something that was a surprise to me when I started studying it closely. But Edersheim talks about the generations list, the 10 of them. And Alfred Edersheim says this in a book he wrote called The World Before the Flood, about the order of these 10 generations or lists. Edersheim says, with reference to the special arrangement of the generations recorded throughout the book of Genesis, it will be noticed that, so to speak, the side branches are always cut off before the main branch is carried onwards. Thus the history of Cain and his race precedes that of Seth. Cain is in chapter 4, Seth and his descendants is in chapter 5. The genealogy of Japheth and of Ham is listed before that of Shem. That's in chapter 10. For the principle of election and selection, of separation and of grace underlies from the first the whole history of the covenant. So Esau's line is listed, Ishmael's line before that. They're all sidebars to the main narrative of the elect race. That is, of course, the nation that is going to be created out of Abraham.
Yeah.
Now, Gordon Wenham also has a point about the greater structural issue, which is not the internal divisions of the book, but the place of Genesis in the large picture. Not so much the entire Old Testament yet, but what they call the Hexateuch. We usually hear the word Pentateuch, meaning the 5 books of Moses. But most study of Genesis and the other books of the first 6 are hexateuchal, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, hexateuchal studies today, not just pentateuchal. So
because they include Joshua as part of the story.
Yeah, Joshua is the 6th book, and really in one sense the most important of the 6, because it's the end of the story, i.e. all the promises are fulfilled by the end of the book of Joshua. At least the promises having to do with the election and placement of Israel in the promised land, right? Now this is how Wenham sums up the significance of the book within the big picture of the Hexateuch. Finally, in reflecting on the contents of Genesis, it must never be forgotten that it is the first of a 5 or 6 volume work, the Pentateuch or Hexateuch. It gives the background of the history of the Exodus from Egypt and the law-giving at Sinai, which are dealt with in great detail in Exodus to Deuteronomy. Whereas according to Genesis' own chronology, the first book of the Pentateuch spans some 2,000 years, the next 4 cover a mere 120. This helps to put Genesis into perspective. It does not stand on its own, but rather contains essential background for understanding those events which constituted the nation of Israel as the Lord's covenant people. It would therefore not be surprising to find adumbrations, that is, foreshadowings, of the later national history in the story of the patriarchs. In turn, too, the primeval history, that is chapters 1 to 11, must be seen in this perspective. It is also essentially preparatory in function and puts the patriarchs into their cosmic context. I like that phrase. The God who called Abraham was no local divinity, but the creator of the whole universe. The succession of catastrophes that befell humanity prior to Abraham's call show just why the election of Abraham, and in him Israel, was necessary. So even that comment at the end of his intro, Wenham is saying even the concept of election, which can be a stumbling block to many, is put within the context of God's general larger purpose. The election has to do with the preparation for an even greater work in the future.
Yeah, so it's kind of helping us to see Genesis as an explanation for the election of a people, the purpose, like what's God's end run for this? Why is he doing what he does? It sets it up for us.
Yeah, and another stumbling block is, of course, that many people view the book of Genesis, many people, I'm saying millions of people, especially in North America, view the book of Genesis as giving us not only a tight, short chronology, but an absolute opposition between creation and, let's say, evolution. So the question that comes up right away when you're dealing with the beginning of the book of Genesis is the purpose of this book to give us a scientific theory of the beginning of the universe?
Yeah.
And you assume that if you're a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, and you would think so by the amount of time people fight over this and talk about this. But is that really the purpose of the book?
So the question we want to ask at the beginning of the book of Genesis is that word how or who? Is Genesis science or theology? So we'll get into that next time.